To understand how William Wallace died, you first have to understand the world he was born into, a world of absolutely breathtaking violence. This was a time when the lines between king and country, loyalty and betrayal, were drawn and redrawn in blood. Welcome to late 13th century Scotland, a kingdom teetering on the edge of a cliff. The whole mess started when King Alexander III died in 1286, and then, tragically, so did his young heir, the Maid of Norway. This plunged the entire nation into a crisis. With no clear ruler, the Scottish nobles made a fateful decision. They asked their powerful southern neighbor, King Edward I of England, to step in and settle the dispute. Edward, known to history as Longshanks for his sheer height and imposing presence, was a formidable and ruthless monarch. On the one hand, he was a veteran of the Crusades, a brilliant military mind, and a legal reformer. But under that shiny veneer of chivalry was a man with a single, unyielding ambition to bring the entire island of Britain under his direct control. He saw Scotland's crisis not as a problem to solve, but as a golden opportunity. He picked a man named John Balliol to be the new King of Scots, but only after forcing all the other Scottish lords to recognize him, Edward, as the ultimate overlord of Scotland. In one move, he effectively stripped Scotland of its independence, turning it into a puppet state. The humiliation was just unbearable. Edward's demands became more and more oppressive. He treated Scotland less like a kingdom and more like a personal backyard, summoning its king to English courts and demanding Scottish soldiers for his wars in France. By 1296, the Scottish nobles had had enough. They formed an alliance with England's old enemy, France, and acted open defiance. Edward's response was swift and absolutely cataclysmic. He marched north with a gigantic army, sacked the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, and massacred its people. He then crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, captured King John Balliol, and publicly stripped him of his royal status, earning Balliol the pathetic nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat. As a final insult, Edward seized the Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings, and dragged it to Westminster Abbey. Scotland, it seemed, was broken. But from the ashes of that defeat, a fire of resistance began to smolder. It wasn't lit in the castles of the great lords, many of whom had already bent the knee to Edward. It was lit in the forests and towns, among the common people. And the man who would fan the ember into a raging inferno wasn't a powerful earl or a claimant to the throne. He was a minor knight from Renfrewshire, a man whose name was William Wallace. Wallace was a man of the people, and his rebellion was sparked by a personal tragedy: the murder of his love, Marion Braveheart, by the English Sheriff of Lanark. This quest for personal vengeance quickly spiraled into a full-blown rebellion. Wallace was charismatic, bold, and a master of guerrilla warfare. He and his followers launched a series of hit-and-run attacks on English garrisons, and his legend grew with every victory. He wasn't fighting for a title or for land, he was fighting for the very idea of a free Scotland. And that idea resonated deeply with people groaning under the weight of English occupation. His defining moment came in September 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Alongside his co-commander, the strategically minded Andrew Murray, Wallace faced a much larger English army. The English, arrogant and totally overconfident, tried to cross a narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace and Murray waited, holding their nerve until about half the English army was trapped on the other side. Then, they sprang the trap. The Scots charged down from the high ground, took control of the bridgehead, and slaughtered the English soldiers who were now caught with nowhere to run. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. It shattered the myth of English invincibility and sent shockwaves through Edward's regime. In the aftermath, William Wallace was knighted and named the Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. For a brief, glorious moment, Scotland was free. But Wallace knew that freedom was fragile. King Edward I was not the kind of man to take a humiliating defeat lying down. He was enraged. He gathered a new, even larger army, this time equipped with the devastating English longbow, and in 1298, he marched north to crush the rebellion himself. The two armies met at Falkirk. This time, there was no narrow bridge to give the Scots an advantage. On the open field, Wallace's spearmen, packed into defensive circles called schiltrons, were helpless against the storm of arrows from Edward's longbowmen. The Scottish cavalry, mostly nobles whose loyalty was shaky at best, fled the field. The result was a catastrophe for the Scots. Wallace's army was annihilated. He managed to escape with his life, but his military reputation was in tatters. He resigned the guardianship of Scotland and became a fugitive, a ghost haunting the lands he had fought so hard to liberate. For 7 long years, Wallace evaded capture. He traveled to France, maybe even Rome, desperately seeking support for the Scottish cause. But the great powers of Europe had their own problems. Back in Scotland, the resistance sputtered on, but it was fractured. Robert the Bruce, a rival claimant to the throne who had a bad habit of switching sides, was starting to emerge as a new leader. But for King Edward I, there was one piece of unfinished business. One man whose freedom was a personal, knowing insult to his authority. He offered pardons to other Scottish nobles, but for William Wallace, there would be no mercy. A huge price was put on his head. Edward didn't just want Wallace captured, he wanted him erased. He wanted to make an example of this commoner who had dared to defy a king. And in the summer of 1305, that obsession would finally be fulfilled, leading to an end so deliberately cruel, so perfectly designed for maximum suffering, that it would echo in horror for centuries. King Edward I didn't just want to kill William Wallace, he wanted to make an example of him. The punishment he designed was meant to be a spectacle of cruelty so extreme, so full of horror and humiliation, that it would crush the spirit of Scotland forever. But it didn't work. In this video, we'll break down the agonizing, step-by-step process of William Wallace's execution and reveal how this ultimate act of cruelty backfired, creating a martyr that would inspire Scotland for centuries. For 7 years, William Wallace was the most wanted man in Britain. While other Scottish leaders, including Robert the Bruce, had submitted to Edward I, Wallace remained an unyielding symbol of defiance. He was a phantom, moving through the familiar landscapes of his homeland, protected by a network of common folk who saw him not as an outlaw, but as their champion. Edward, frustrated and obsessed, knew that Wallace couldn't be caught by English soldiers alone. The ghost had to be betrayed by one of his own. The man who would go down in history for this act was Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight. Menteith's story is complicated, a classic tale of the shifting allegiances of the time. He'd actually fought for Scotland at the Battle of Dunbar in 1296 and was captured by the English. At some point, he made his peace with Edward and swore loyalty to the English crown. For this, he was rewarded with power, eventually becoming the governor of the strategic Dumbarton Castle. To Edward, Menteith was a valuable asset, a Scot who knew the land and the people. To many Scots, he would forever be known as Foss Menteith, Menteith the False, the traitor. The exact details of the betrayal are lost to history, pieced together from later chronicles. It's believed the crucial tip-off came from one of Wallace's own servants, a man named Jack Short, who told Menteith where his master was hiding. Another story, probably folklore, tells of a prearranged signal. Menteith's nephew, who was with Wallace, would alert his uncle by turning a loaf of bread upside down on a tavern table. On the night of August 5, 1305, at a place called Robroyston, near Glasgow, the trap was sprung. Wallace was taken completely by surprise, reportedly seized right out of his bed. Unarmed and outnumbered, the great warrior who had faced down entire armies was captured without a fight. From Robroyston, Wallace was taken to Dumbarton Castle, under Menteith's command. For his role in the capture, Menteith received a handsome reward from King Edward, land worth £100 a fortune back then. He had delivered the prize that Edward craved above all others. The journey that followed was the beginning of Wallace's final ordeal. It was a long, brutal march of nearly 400 miles from Dumbarton to London. This wasn't a quick trip, it was a deliberately slow procession, designed to display Wallace like a captive beast. He was paraded through English towns and villages, a living trophy of Edward's supposed final victory. He was no longer the guardian of Scotland, he was a prisoner, bound for a fate that had been decided long before he ever saw a courtroom. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall, the grandest secular building in England in the very heart of English royal power. Let's be clear, this was not a trial in any real sense of the word. There was no jury, no defense lawyer, and no presumption of innocence. It was a show trial, a piece of political theater designed for one purpose, to legally brand William Wallace as a traitor, justifying the horrific punishment that was already planned. The scene was set for maximum humiliation. Wallace was forced to sit on a bench at the south end of the Great Hall. In a final act of mockery, a crown of laurel leaves was shoved onto his head, a cruel jab meant to paint him as a commoner who had dared to imagine himself a king. Sir Peter Mallory, the King's Chief Justice, read the charges. It was a long list designed to paint Wallace not as a freedom fighter, but as a monster. He was accused of high treason for waging war against King Edward. He was accused of murder, robbery, and sacrilege, with specific mention of atrocities against English civilians, including women and clergy, sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun. The goal was to strip him of all moral authority and replace the image of a patriot with that of a bloodthirsty criminal. For most of the proceedings, Wallace was silent. He knew it was a farce. But on the central charge of treason, he refused to stay quiet. It was then that he delivered the most defiant statement of his life. When accused of being a traitor to King Edward, Wallace's voice rang out through the hole. He declared, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." It was a brilliant legal and moral argument. Wallace was stating a simple fact. He was a Scot, born in the Kingdom of Scotland. He had never sworn an oath of allegiance to the English king. So how could he possibly be guilty of betraying a sovereign he never recognized? In his mind, his actions weren't treason. They were acts of war, defending his nation against a foreign invader. His defense was powerful, logical, and completely pointless. The court wasn't there to debate the law. They were there to deliver the verdict Edward I had ordered. Wallace was swiftly found guilty on all counts. Then, the sentence was pronounced. It was the full, horrific penalty for high treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't just a method of execution, it was a brutal ritual, with every step designed to inflict the maximum possible pain, terror, and degradation. The sentence itself was a raw declaration of power. Wallace had fought for Scotland with his sword. Now, his death was going to be used as a weapon against it. The execution of William Wallace on August 23, 1305, wasn't just a killing. It was a state-sanctioned performance of cruelty, a public spectacle designed to burn itself into the memory of all who saw or heard of it. The method hanged, drawn, and quartered was the most extreme punishment in the English legal arsenal, save for the ultimate crime, high treason. It involved multiple deaths, each more agonizing than the last, and every step was a calculated message from King Edward I. The ordeal began right after the sentencing at Westminster Hall. Wallace was taken from the hole, stripped completely naked, and tied to a hurdle, which was basically a wooden fence panel. The hurdle was then tied by a rope to the back of a horse. This was the drawing part of the sentence. He was dragged for miles through the filthy, cobblestone streets of London, from the Tower to the execution site at Smithfield. This was no quick parade. It was deliberately slow, a traveling show of degradation. The rough stones would have torn his bare skin to shreds, leaving him a bloody mess before the main event even began. The physical pain was only part of it. The crowds lining the streets screamed abuse, spat on him, and threw filth, rotten food, and stones. This ritual served a purposes. It inflicted unbelievable suffering and it made the public complicit in the punishment, turning the execution into a communal act of the king's justice. After what must have felt like an eternity, the procession arrived at the Elms at Smithfield, a traditional execution spot. A large gallows stood waiting. Wallace was hauled up, and a rope was placed around his neck. He was hanged, but not to kill him. It was a hanging designed as pure torture. He was hoisted into the air and left to strangle, to feel life choking out of him. But just before he could die, just before unconsciousness could offer any escape, he was cut down. He crashed to the ground, alive, conscious, and gasping for breath, having endured the agony of near asphyxiation. He had to be awake for what came next. This next stage is almost horrifying to imagine, yet it was the core of the punishment for treason. While Wallace lay on the ground, fully conscious, the executioner approached with his knives. First, he was emasculated, his genitals cut off and held up for the crowd to see, a symbolic act to extinguish his lineage and manhood. Then, the executioner sliced his abdomen open. Reaching into the cavity, he began to pull out Wallace's intestines, organ by organ. In the ultimate act of psychological terror, his bowels were thrown into a nearby fire and burned before his still living eyes. According to the official sentence, this was the punishment for his traitorous thoughts. Some accounts suggest his heart, seen as the seat of his treason, was the last organ to be ripped from his chest. It's impossible to comprehend the level of agony he must have endured. He was being slowly dismembered while fully aware of what was happening to him. Only after he had suffered these unspeakable mutilations, likely on the very edge of death from shock and blood loss, was the final act of mercy granted. Wallace was beheaded. His head was severed from his ravaged body, finally ending his suffering. But even then, the king's vengeance wasn't finished. the headless corpse was laid on a butcher's block. Using an axe, the executioner hacked the body into 4 separate pieces. This was a quartering. The body of William Wallace, the man who had united Scotland, was now just a collection of dismembered parts, ready to be used for the king's final, chilling message. King Edward I had planned every horrifying detail of the execution with one goal in mind: to use Wallace's body as a tool of terror, a grotesque advertisement for the price of rebellion. The plan was to so thoroughly destroy the man that the very idea of Scottish resistance would die with him. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, and it would prove to be one of the biggest miscalculations of Edward's entire reign. The distribution of Wallace's remains was the final part of the ritual. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and then impaled on a spike on London Bridge. It was a grisly, unavoidable warning to everyone entering or leaving the city. His 4 quartered limbs were sent to a much wider audience. They were displayed in 4 key locations: one in Newcastle, an English city near the border, one in Berwick, the Scottish town Edward had brutally sacked, and the final 2 were sent deep into Scotland itself, one to Stirling, the site of Wallace's greatest victory, and the other to Perth. The message couldn't have been clearer. From the capital of England to the heart of Scotland, the physical proof of Edward's wrath was on display. There would be no grave, no Christian burial, no place for mourning. He was to be scattered, dishonored, and reduced to rotting meat for the crows. Edward must have thought he had won. He had captured and obliterated his most hated enemy. He had shown his absolute power in the most visceral way imaginable. He expected fear and submission. He got the exact opposite, instead of crushing the Scots. The sheer barbarity of Wallace's execution horrified and enraged them. The story of his defiant death, his refusal to bow to a foreign king, spread like wildfire. The public display of his butchered remains didn't inspire fear, it created relics of a martyr. The man who had fought for them had been tortured and torn apart by a tyrant. Wallace was no longer just a failed rebel. He was a symbol of English cruelty and the ultimate justification for Scotland's fight for freedom. This wave of anger found its new champion in Robert the Bruce. Bruce had a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne, but his past was complicated. He had often switched sides, even fighting for Edward at times, but Wallace's martyrdom seems to have been the turning point. Just 6 months after Wallace was executed, in February 1306, Robert the Bruce made his final, decisive move. He murdered his main rival for the throne, John Comyn, and had himself crowned King of Scots. There was no going back. He picked up the banner that Wallace had been forced to drop. Bruce learned from Wallace's successes and failures. He adopted Wallace's guerrilla tactics, avoiding big battles and using the Scottish terrain to his advantage. He united the nobles and rallied the common people, whose resolve was now hardened by the memory of Wallace's sacrifice. The name Wallace became a battle cry. Edward I, old and infuriated that the rebellion was burning brighter than ever, died in 1307 on his way north to crush Bruce. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's ruthless determination. This gave Bruce the time he needed to consolidate his power. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce led the Scottish army to a decisive, nation-defining victory over the English. It was the culmination of everything Wallace had started. Scotland's independence was, for a time, finally secured. The backfire was complete. Edward I's act of supreme cruelty, designed to erase a man, had instead made him immortal. The legacy of William Wallace far outlasted the gruesome spectacle of his death. Long after his remains had withered away, his story was kept alive, first in songs and poems, and later in an epic 15th century poem by a minstrel known as Blind Harry, titled *The Wallace*. This work, though full of historical embellishments, captured the spirit of the man and cemented his status as Scotland's national hero. His martyrdom also echoes in the most important document in Scottish history, the Declaration of Arbroath. In 1320, 15 years after Wallace's execution, Scottish nobles sent a letter to the Pope, asking him to recognize Scotland's independence. The letter contains one of the most powerful statements of freedom ever written. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. While Wallace isn't mentioned by name, the principle for which he died is etched into every single word. That same fierce desire for liberty would later influence the founding fathers of the United States, many of whom knew Scotland's long fight for self-determination. In the end, King Edward I's brutal attempt to make an example of William Wallace was a catastrophic failure. He wanted the punishment to be so horrifying that it would be the final word on Scottish resistance. He wanted to show that he had the power not just to kill a man, but to unmake him, to scatter him to the winds so that nothing remained. But what Edward failed to understand is that you can't kill an idea with a blade. You can't dismember a symbol. By subjecting Wallace to the worst imaginable fate, he didn't erase him, he sanctified him. The horrifying execution transformed a mortal man into an immortal martyr, a symbol of defiance against tyranny that has inspired people around the world for over 700 years. Edward I wanted William Wallace to be remembered as a traitor. Instead, thanks to the king's own unimaginable cruelty, he is remembered as a hero. If you found this journey into the dark and defined history of William Wallace compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the shadows of the past. Let us know in the comments what you think was Edward's punishment, a necessary act of state power, or the fatal mistake that sealed Scotland's resolve. We read all your comments. Thanks for watching.